Where do you want to start? I know you have a lot of stories. So
My life.
yeah.
Well, I was born in 1926, and my father later told me about the time of my birth was the financial hardest time for his family. I had an older brother, 2 years older, and a sister who was 6 years older. And I was the last child. Bob apparently resented the new baby, and he was pounding my head. Mother went to a psychologist, and he said, well, Robert has been the king of the little family for a couple of years, and then this intruder comes in, and people are paying attention to the baby and not to Robert. And so he said, well, you probably should try and find a social place for Robert. And at that time, Mother was working for the LA Board of Education. They had an experimental nursery school at Vermont Square in South Los Angeles. So my parents moved close to that nursery school, and Bob was enrolled. And when I was 2 and 9 months or so, I was enrolled. So I sometimes say that this city, Los Angeles Unified School District, and the state of California educated me for 20-some years with no tuition. When I hear current students attracting debt in order to pay their tuition, it makes me feel I was privileged. We lived in South LA. It was a white working class district at that time. We moved to West Hollywood in 1937. They bought a house for $4,000. And my father, he worked for Sears Roebuck as a appliance salesman. Then he got a job with the Edison Company, and he worked for that until he retired.
What was your mother like? What kind of woman was she?
My mother, I gather she'd been something of a beauty in her youth. By the time I knew her, she had white hair. She liked to read. She would read books, and she would subscribe to the Saturday Review of Literature and so on. She had been engaged to an Englishman, an English lecturer in international affairs, who died in the First World War, and that was a tragedy for her. But she recovered, and she married my father. But when I knew her, her great passion was pacifism. She thought war was crazy and that we shouldn't do it. And after we moved to West Hollywood, she heard the minister of Mount Hollywood Congregational Church defending pacifism on a radio program. And she said, that's the church for us.
And this is where your pacifism activism work comes.
Now, the minister there, Alan Hunter, was one of the finest people I've ever known, and I became very much his disciple in junior high school and high school. Alan was both a social gospeler and he believed in the inner life, and he led meditation groups and so on. And he had Gerald Hurd, the Anglo-Irish intellectual, had moved to Laurel Canyon, and Alan got him to preach one Sunday a month. I was very impressed by Gerald, and I was a pacifist in a country at war, and that was not very popular. I remember when the Japanese internment was announced in 1942, talking to a hostile group of my colleagues who all supported it, lock up the Japs. And I said, I argue it's unconstitutional. You can't lock people up because their ancestors came from Japan. But I had the feeling I was pretty isolated. Gerald had started Tobruk College by then, and the people that gathered at Tobruk were mostly pacifists. And I asked Gerald if I could come and stay there, and he said I could. So the day after I graduated from high school, I went to Tobruk, and I stayed there for about 11 months. We meditated 3 hours a day, and we had a garden, and we took care of about 350 acres that was being used as pasture for cattle. And then I was drafted, and my draft board classified me 1A, but you could appeal to a selective service appeal board in Washington. But I was told that it was unlikely that they would reverse this, so I was preparing for 3 or 5 years in the federal penitentiary in the 6 months that elapsed. But a member of Allen's church was John Anson Ford, who was the county supervisor for West Los Angeles, and he wrote a testimonial letter to the Selective Service Appeal Board vouching for my character and sincerity and so on. The appeal board granted the appeal. I had an interesting experience when I was in a CPS camp in Great Smoky Mountains, and I was the cook, and a veteran, a big, tall, handsome guy who'd fought in France and into Germany, was put as the steward over me, my boss now. And I remember one time he looked at me and he said, "Will, what are you doing here?" And I realized that he felt he was in with a bunch of delinquents, and that it was like a prison. But my feeling was he was a man of honor, and he had fought a war that he believed in. I didn't fight the war that I didn't believe in. But anyway, after I got out of CPS, I went back to Tobruk and remained there. I can remember the time somebody said to me, "What are you going to do now?" And I said, "Well, I have to figure that out." And so I decided what I'd like to be would be a professor of philosophy. But to do that, you have to study philosophy. And I had only a haphazard notion of philosophy, so I enrolled at UCLA.
How did you meet Sue?
She had finished the coursework at Antioch College. Yeah. She was a philosophy major. She married a rich young man the day after she turned 20. She had Paul, and she had become a single mother, and she needed to get a job to get the work credit to complete her degree. Her friend said they're looking for a secretary at Washington University. She was a very good secretary. She was precise, so I was delighted with the work she did. That year, so a student organized a student march to control nuclear armament. Whether Sue got permission to close the department so she could take part in the students' walk. I drove down Lindley until I caught up with the marchers, and then I joined them. And Sue and I chatted as we marched along, and then we went to a kind of hippie bar where they had folk music and had a drink. And then I took her home, and the babysitter left, and we had a long talk, and we started dating. We dated through the rest of 63 and 64. I said to Sue, "Why don't we get married when I get my dissertation approved?" And she said, "Why don't we get married right now, and I'll help you finish your dissertation." And I thought we would have a good marriage. And I told her that when I proposed. I said, "I think we'll have a good marriage." But anyway, I found Sue very attractive, and we shared values. She was friendly to Quakerism. She was friendly to socialism and pacifism.
I kind of wanted to ask, what was the hardest part?
The hardest part of life for me was my wife's death was hard. She had a year and a half of illness before she died. She was sensible about it. She realized when she got her diagnosis that it was terminal. Let's see, she died what year, Jim?
97.
97. How long ago was that?
21 years ago. It'll be 22 in October.
No, 22 years.
Almost 20 years.
And there's her smiling face up in the...
Mm-hmm.
But I was born in a good country, in a good state, in a good family. I went to good schools. I went to a good university, and I had a good job, and I had a good wife, and I had good sons, and I had good friends and comrades, so I don't have anything to complain about. Isherwood was a disciple of Gerald. In fact, Isherwood has me as a character in one of his novels. His boyfriend at that time made a pass at me, which I rejected, but it apparently got Isherwood thinking. So in this novel, he puts in a young girl who struck him like a reindeer in the north.
This character that's supposed to be you?
Yeah, well, the character was two sisters, I should say, but it was clearly my brother and I. It came out of Isherwood's journal. But I was kind of struck that Isherwood thought I was like a reindeer.